The cruelest rumors are often born from the kindest sacrifices. I never imagined those words would one day describe my own family. For most of my life, I believed that generosity should be quiet. My late husband used to tell me that the best gifts were the ones that expected nothing in return, and after 45 years of marriage, I had learned to live by that simple philosophy. So when my grandson Ethan received his acceptance letter to Ohio State University, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Thomas and I had started a college fund for our future grandchildren decades earlier. Every Christmas, every tax refund, every little bonus from his engineering job, we quietly added something to that account. We never talked about it because we never wanted anyone to feel obligated. It was simply our promise to the future. Thomas passed away 6 years ago, but before he left this world, he held my hand and smiled. "Make sure one of our grandchildren gets the education we always dreamed about," he whispered. I carried those words in my heart every single day. The morning after Ethan's acceptance letter arrived, I drove to my financial advisor's office carrying the same leather folder Thomas had used for years. We reviewed the education fund together, and after confirming everything once more, I authorized the payment for Ethan's first year of tuition, housing, books, and required university fees. Watching the confirmation appear on the computer screen filled me with a happiness I had not felt in a very long time. I imagined Thomas smiling somewhere, proud that we had kept our promise together. I asked my advisor not to mention the payment to anyone because I wanted Ethan to enjoy his graduation party without feeling embarrassed or indebted. My plan was simple. After everyone had celebrated, I would quietly tell him that his grandfather had helped make his future possible. A week later, our family gathered at Michael and Rebecca's house for a backyard graduation celebration. The weather was beautiful, with blue skies, warm sunshine, and the smell of hamburgers drifting across the lawn. Friends, neighbors, cousins, and relatives laughed beneath strings of patio lights, while Ethan thanked everyone for coming. Watching him smile in his graduation cap reminded me of the little boy who used to chase butterflies across my backyard every summer. During dinner, several relatives began asking how Ethan planned to pay for college. Before I could answer, Rebecca smiled confidently and waved her hand as though she already knew the whole story. Thankfully, Eleanor insisted on paying, she said with a little laugh. Honestly, I keep telling her she needs to stop giving money away. She practically emptied her savings doing this. She is too proud to admit it, but she is basically broke now. The conversation stopped almost instantly. Every face around the table turned toward me. Some looked surprised. Others looked deeply concerned. One of my cousins quietly reached over and squeezed my arm. Another relative asked whether I would still be able to keep my house. I could barely hear their voices. I simply looked across the yard at Rebecca. She smiled politely, completely unaware that every word she had spoken had begun rewriting the story of my life in front of the people I loved most. I smiled politely that afternoon because I did not know what else to do. Correcting Rebecca in front of everyone would only have embarrassed Ethan on one of the happiest days of his life, and after everything Thomas and I had done to make that day possible, I refused to let my pride become the center of the celebration. So I quietly thanked my cousin for her concern, accepted another glass of iced tea, and changed the subject whenever someone asked whether I was going to be all right. On the drive home, however, the silence inside my car felt heavier than usual. I kept replaying Rebecca's words in my mind. She had not said them with cruelty. She had smiled the entire time. That somehow made them hurt even more. She truly seemed to believe she was sharing harmless information, never realizing that she had transformed a private act of love into a public story about financial desperation. The following Monday, I stopped by my neighborhood grocery store just after 9 in the morning. I had barely placed a loaf of whole wheat bread into my shopping cart when Mrs. Simmons, a longtime neighbor, hurried toward me with an expression filled with sympathy. She lowered her voice and gently asked whether everything was going to be all right financially. Before I could answer, she quietly mentioned that if I ever needed help with groceries or transportation, several women from church would gladly organize a schedule. Her kindness touched me deeply, but her words confirmed that Rebecca's comment had already begun traveling far beyond one family barbecue. I thanked her sincerely and assured her I was doing perfectly well. She smiled, although I could tell she did not completely believe me. Later that week, my son Michael called and asked whether he could stop by after work. When he arrived, He walked slowly through the house looking at things he had seen his entire life. He paused in front of Thomas's old woodworking bench, glanced around the living room, and finally sat across from me in the kitchen. "Mom," he began carefully, "Rebecca and I have been talking. Maybe this house has become too much for one person. If money is getting tight, you know you do not have to carry everything alone." I looked at my son for several seconds before answering. There was genuine concern in his eyes. That was what made the conversation so painful. He was not trying to pressure me. He honestly believed the story he had heard. I simply smiled and told him that I appreciated his love more than he probably realized. Then I changed the conversation by asking about Ethan's first week of orientation. Michael seemed relieved, almost grateful that I had not argued with him. After he left, I walked into Thomas's study and stood beside the old oak desk where we had balanced our checkbook together for decades. Every drawer reminded me of how carefully we had planned for the future. We had sacrificed vacations, delayed buying new cars, and passed on countless little luxuries because we believed education was the greatest inheritance we could leave behind. Looking around that quiet room, I realized something important. Rebecca had not merely shared inaccurate information. She had unknowingly changed the way people now looked at me. Instead of seeing the woman who had carefully prepared for her family's future, they saw someone who had made a reckless financial decision and was now quietly struggling. That evening I sat alone on the back porch as the sun disappeared behind the maple trees Thomas had planted years earlier. For the first time since paying Ethan's tuition, I understood that the money itself had never been the true sacrifice. The real cost was watching my own story slowly rewritten by people who had never bothered to ask me whether it was true. Over the next several weeks, I began noticing something far more painful than whispered conversations. It was the way people looked at me. Friends who had always greeted me with cheerful smiles now asked careful questions, as though they were afraid I might break if they spoke too directly. At church, Mrs. Reynolds quietly slipped an envelope into my purse before Sunday service. I did not discover it until I returned home. Inside was a handwritten note that read, "Please accept this small gift until things get easier." There was a $200 grocery gift card tucked beneath the note. I sat at my kitchen table holding it for several minutes. Her kindness brought tears to my eyes, but they were not tears of gratitude alone. They were tears of realization. The story had traveled much farther than I had imagined. I called Mrs. Reynolds immediately to thank her and gently explained that I was not experiencing financial hardship. She sounded relieved, yet also confused. "Rebecca mentioned that you had sacrificed everything for Ethan," she said softly. "She made it sound like you would never admit you needed help." I assured her that Ethan's education had been planned for many years and that I appreciated her generous heart more than she could know. After we hung up, I found myself wondering how many other conversations had taken place without me. A few days later, I stopped by the local garden center to buy autumn mums for my front porch. The cashier, whom I had known for years, smiled warmly before quietly mentioning that senior discounts were available if I ever needed extra savings. She meant well. Everyone meant well. That was what made the situation so complicated. Nobody was mocking me. Nobody was trying to hurt me. They were simply responding to a story they believed was true. Rebecca had never called me irresponsible. She had never accused me of making foolish decisions. She had simply repeated one assumption often enough that it became accepted as fact. The hardest part was realizing that no one had thought to ask me whether it was accurate. One evening, Helen Carter stopped by carrying 2 slices of homemade apple pie. We sat on the back porch watching the sunset paint the maple trees in shades of orange and gold. After a long silence, she looked at me with gentle concern. "Eleanor," she said, "people are talking because they care about you, but they are talking all the same." She explained that several members of our church committee had quietly discussed organizing a fundraiser to help me with household expenses before someone suggested asking my family first. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to absorb what she had just said. A fundraiser. My late husband and I had spent decades planning carefully so our family would never have to worry about money. Yet now people believed I needed charity because of one misunderstanding that had never been corrected. Helen reached over and squeezed my hand. "You could end all of this with one conversation," she whispered. I nodded slowly, knowing she was right. Still, something inside me held back. If I rushed to defend myself now, it would become an argument over who was right and who was wrong. I did not want that. I wanted something much simpler. I wanted the truth to speak for itself. As Helen drove away that evening, I remained on the porch listening to the quiet rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. That was the moment I made a decision. I would stop trying to imagine how the rumors had started or how far they had spread. Instead, I would quietly gather every fact, every document, and every answer I might one day need. When the time finally came to tell my story, I wanted no room left for assumptions. The morning after I made that decision, I drove to the financial advisory office where Thomas and I had planned nearly every important milestone of our married life. The receptionist greeted me by name before leading me into the same conference room where we had celebrated paying off our mortgage almost 20 years earlier. Seeing those familiar walls brought back memories of Thomas sitting beside me with his yellow legal pad, always asking thoughtful questions before signing a single document. My advisor smiled warmly and asked how Ethan was enjoying the beginning of his first semester. I told him everything was going well before explaining why I had come. I wanted to review every account Thomas and I had established over the years, not because I doubted our planning, but because I wanted complete confidence in every fact before speaking another word about my finances. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing retirement accounts, investment statements, insurance policies, and the education fund Thomas and I had created decades earlier. Every page told the same story. The tuition payment for Ethan represented exactly what the account had always been designed to accomplish. It had never come from my retirement savings. It had never placed my home at risk. It had never changed my ability to live comfortably for the rest of my life. My advisor gently reminded me that Thomas had insisted on building generous safety margins into every long-term plan because he wanted me to feel secure no matter what happened after he was gone. Hearing those words filled me with quiet gratitude. Before leaving, I requested printed copies of every relevant document along with a clear summary explaining how the education fund had been established years before Ethan was even born. I placed everything carefully inside Thomas's old leather folder. It felt strangely comforting to carry the same folder he had trusted for so many years. On my way home, I stopped at the cemetery where Thomas rested beneath a simple gray headstone surrounded by maple trees. I sat on the nearby bench for a long while, telling him everything that had happened since Ethan's graduation party. I admitted that I was hurt, confused, and disappointed, but I also confessed that I did not want revenge. I wanted understanding. I wanted my family to remember that assumptions could quietly damage relationships even when no one intended harm. The gentle autumn breeze carried fallen leaves across the grass as though reminding me that every season eventually changes. When I returned home that afternoon, I organized every document into neat sections across my dining room table. Looking at those orderly stacks of paper, I realized they represented much more than numbers. They represented decades of discipline, sacrifice, and promises faithfully kept. Thomas and I had built this future one careful decision at a time. No rumor could erase that truth. Late that evening, my telephone rang. It was Rebecca. Her cheerful voice carried the same warmth it always had as she casually mentioned that she had been thinking about organizing a small family meeting the following weekend. She explained that everyone cared about me and wanted to discuss ways to make life easier now that finances seemed more challenging. I listened quietly without correcting her. After thanking her for thinking of me, I accepted the invitation. When the call ended, I looked once more at the leather folder resting on the dining table. For the first time since this misunderstanding began, I no longer felt anxious about what others believed. I knew exactly what the truth looked like, and I had a growing sense that before long, everyone else would have the opportunity to see it as clearly as I did. The days leading up to the family meeting passed more quietly than I expected. No one questioned me directly about my finances anymore. Instead, I noticed small changes in the way people spoke to me. Michael called twice to ask whether I needed anything from the hardware store. Rebecca texted to see if I wanted leftovers from dinner. Even Ethan phoned one evening to tell me about his first chemistry class and to thank me again for always believing in him. Listening to his excitement reminded me why I had made the decision to help in the first place. None of this had ever been about recognition. It had always been about giving my grandson a beginning that my husband and I had worked so hard to prepare for. On Thursday afternoon, Helen stopped by carrying 2 cups of coffee from our favorite cafe. We sat on the front porch watching squirrels gather acorns beneath the maple trees while the cool autumn air drifted through the neighborhood. After a few minutes, she looked at me thoughtfully and asked whether I planned to confront Rebecca during the family meeting. I smiled and slowly shook my head. No, I answered. People become defensive when they think they are being accused. I do not want anyone defending themselves. I want everyone listening. Helen nodded quietly before saying something that stayed with me. Truth has a different voice than anger, she whispered. I repeated those words several times after she left because they sounded exactly like something Thomas would have said. That evening I opened the leather folder one more time and carefully reviewed every document. The education account had been established 27 years earlier, long before Ethan was even born. Every annual contribution was clearly documented. The investment statements showed decades of steady growth. My retirement accounts remained healthy, my home had been paid off for years, and my monthly income comfortably exceeded my living expenses. There was nothing dramatic hidden inside those pages. They simply reflected a lifetime of patient planning. Looking at them filled me with quiet confidence rather than pride. The following morning, Rebecca called again to confirm the time of Saturday's gathering. She sounded cheerful and explained that several close family members would be attending because everyone wanted to discuss ways of supporting me moving forward. Her words caught my attention. Supporting me. It was remarkable how quickly an assumption had become a shared belief. I thanked her for organizing everything and told her I looked forward to seeing everyone. After hanging up, I placed the leather folder beside my handbag and went outside to trim the rose bushes Thomas had planted years earlier. Working with my hands always helped settle my thoughts. As I clipped away the last faded blossoms, I realized I was no longer rehearsing arguments in my mind. I was preparing myself to remain calm no matter what happened. Late that afternoon, I received a handwritten card in the mail from Ethan. Inside, he had written that college already felt overwhelming at times, but every difficult class reminded him how grateful he was for the opportunity to be there. He ended the note by writing that he hoped to make our family proud. I smiled as I carefully folded the card and placed it inside the leather folder beside the financial documents. Somehow it belonged there. One represented years of careful preparation. The other represented the future those years had made possible. As Saturday morning slowly approached, I understood that the upcoming conversation was never really about money. It was about something far more valuable. It was about whether a lifetime of quiet responsibility could withstand a story built on assumptions, and whether the people I loved would be willing to replace rumors with the simple truth once they finally had the chance to hear it. Saturday arrived with clear skies and the kind of cool autumn weather that always reminded me of the years Thomas and I spent raking leaves together in our front yard. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing the same navy blue cardigan I had worn to Ethan's graduation party. Before leaving the house, I placed the leather folder inside my handbag and paused for a moment beside the framed photograph of Thomas sitting on our front porch with a cup of coffee in his hands. I hope I make you proud today, I whispered before quietly closing the front door behind me. Rebecca had chosen to hold the family meeting in her dining room because, as she explained over the telephone, everyone would feel more comfortable there. When I arrived, several relatives had already gathered around the large oak table. My sister-in-law Carol smiled warmly and hugged me. Michael helped me hang my coat by the front door. Ethan hurried over to tell me about a biology lab he had enjoyed that week. For a few wonderful minutes, everything felt completely normal. Then Rebecca gently tapped her coffee mug with a spoon and thanked everyone for coming. She spoke kindly and confidently, explaining that the purpose of the gathering was simply to make sure our family stayed united during what she believed was a difficult season in my life. She emphasized that everyone loved me and wanted to help however they could. No one questioned her words because they sounded thoughtful and compassionate. Rebecca then unfolded several neatly organized papers and placed them on the dining table. They included brochures for smaller condominiums, information about active adult communities, and estimates showing what my house might sell for in the current market. She explained that reducing expenses would allow me to feel less financial pressure after paying for Ethan's education. Michael quietly nodded as she spoke. My sister-in-law looked sympathetic. Even two cousins who had driven in from nearby towns listened with genuine concern. Looking around the room, I realized every person there believed they were participating in an act of kindness. None of them understood that the entire conversation rested upon a misunderstanding that had never been questioned. Rebecca smiled warmly before turning toward me. "Eleanor," she said softly, We know this has probably been overwhelming for you. We thought it might help if we explored some practical options together before things became more stressful." Her voice carried no anger. There was only certainty. She honestly believed she was helping. I folded my hands quietly in my lap and thanked everyone for caring enough to spend their Saturday afternoon with me. Then I asked one simple question. "Before we discuss any plans for my future, may I ask something?" The room immediately grew still. Rebecca nodded. "Of course." I looked around the table at every familiar face before speaking again. "Has anyone here asked me whether I am actually experiencing financial hardship?" No one answered. Several people exchanged uncertain glances. Michael slowly lowered his eyes toward the table. Rebecca looked briefly surprised before replying that everyone had simply assumed the tuition payment must have placed enormous strain on my finances. I smiled gently, not because I found the situation amusing, but because I finally understood how easily assumptions can become accepted as truth when repeated often enough. Without saying another word, I reached into my handbag and rested Thomas's worn leather folder on the dining table. Every conversation in the room suddenly stopped. For the first time since Ethan's graduation celebration, I sensed that people were no longer preparing to speak. They were finally preparing to listen. Every pair of eyes followed the worn leather folder as I slowly opened it on the dining table. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking each passing second. I carefully removed the first document and placed it where everyone could see it. "This," I said gently, "is the education fund Thomas and I created 27 years ago." Michael leaned forward instinctively. Rebecca remained still, her hands folded together in front of her. Ethan looked from my face to the papers without saying a word. I explained that long before Ethan had ever been born, Thomas and I had agreed that if we were fortunate enough to have grandchildren one day, we wanted at least one of them to graduate from college without beginning adulthood buried beneath financial worry. Every birthday, every Christmas bonus, every tax refund that exceeded our expectations, we quietly added something to that account. It was never money taken from our retirement. It was never money meant for household expenses. It had always belonged to the future. I then placed the annual statements beside the original account documents, showing decades of steady contributions and investment growth. The dates stretched back further than anyone at the table seemed to expect. Michael slowly reached for one page before looking up at me with visible surprise. "Dad started this before Ethan was even born?" he asked quietly. I smiled and nodded. "Your father believed that planning years ahead was one of the greatest expressions of love." No one spoke for several long moments. I continued by opening another section of the folder containing my retirement summaries, investment reports, and monthly income statements. I did not read every number aloud. I simply explained what they represented. My retirement remained secure. My home had been paid off for many years. My monthly expenses were comfortably covered. Paying Ethan's first year of tuition had changed none of those realities because Thomas and I had planned for that day decades in advance. The room remained silent. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice softer than I had heard it in weeks. "I honestly thought you had taken the money from your savings," she admitted. "I never meant for people to think." Her sentence faded before she could finish it. I looked at her with calm eyes. "Rebecca," I replied gently, "I believe you truly wanted people to understand how generous the gift was. But somewhere along the way, generosity became sacrifice, sacrifice became financial hardship, and financial hardship became a story everyone accepted without asking me whether it was true." She lowered her eyes immediately. Michael rubbed his forehead with one hand before quietly saying, "I should have asked you first, Mom." Hearing those words did not fill me with satisfaction. They filled me with sadness because one simple conversation weeks earlier could have prevented so much unnecessary hurt. Ethan finally stood from his chair and walked around the table until he reached my side. His eyes had become glassy with emotion as he looked down at the old documents. "Grandma," he whispered, "I thought you had given up everything for me." I gently took his hand and smiled. "No, sweetheart," I answered. "Your grandfather and I gave you exactly what we spent a lifetime preparing to give." As I carefully returned every paper to Thomas's leather folder, I realized the documents themselves had never been the most important part of that afternoon. They simply allowed something much more valuable to return to the room. The truth had finally found its voice, and for the first time since Ethan's graduation celebration, Everyone was listening to the story as it had actually happened instead of the one they had quietly created together. No one reached for the coffee that had been poured before the meeting began. The mug sat untouched while the silence settled over the dining room in a way I had never experienced before. It was not an uncomfortable silence anymore. It was the kind that arrives when people suddenly realize they have been missing an important part of the story. I gently closed the leather folder and rested both hands on top of it. There was nothing else I needed to prove. The documents had already spoken more clearly than I ever could. Rebecca was the first to break the silence. She looked at me with eyes that no longer carried certainty, only regret. "Eleanor," she said quietly, "I never wanted people to believe you had been irresponsible. I thought I was explaining how generous you were. Every time someone asked about Ethan's tuition, I repeated the same thing until it became bigger than it really was. I should have asked you before saying anything." I nodded slowly because I believed she was telling the truth. Carelessness and cruelty are not always the same thing, but careless words can still leave lasting wounds. Michael leaned back in his chair and released a long breath. "I did not even realize I had stopped asking you questions," he admitted. "I kept asking Rebecca what was happening instead of talking to my own mother." His words hurt, not because they were harsh, but because they were honest. Somewhere between concern and convenience, my own voice had quietly disappeared from conversations about my life. Ethan remained standing beside me. He looked toward his parents before turning back to me. "Grandma," he said softly, "I wish I had thanked you differently. I thought you had sacrificed your security for me, and that made me feel guilty every day since school started." I smiled gently and placed my hand over his. "Then let us replace guilt with gratitude," I answered. "Your grandfather and I did not save that money so you would carry a burden. We saved it so you could walk into your future with confidence." I watched his shoulders relax as though a weight had finally been lifted. Carol quietly wiped away a tear before speaking. "I think we all forgot something important," she said. "Helping someone begins by listening to them first." Several heads around the table nodded in agreement. Rebecca reached into the stack of papers she had brought and slowly gathered the brochures for retirement communities and smaller homes. Without saying a word, she placed them back inside her folder. That simple gesture meant more to me than throwing them away ever could. It acknowledged that my future did not need to be planned without me. Before anyone could change the subject, I looked around the room one last time. "There is something I hope all of us remember after today," I said calmly. "Money can always be counted. A reputation cannot. It takes decades to build trust, but only a few repeated assumptions to make people question who you really are. If you ever hear a story about someone you love, ask them before you believe it. Give them the chance to tell their own story." No one interrupted. No one argued. The meeting that had begun with plans to solve a problem ended with something much more meaningful. We had uncovered not a financial crisis, but a communication failure that had quietly grown until it overshadowed the truth. As everyone slowly stood from the table, I noticed the expressions around the room had changed completely. They were no longer looking at me with sympathy. They were looking at me with the same respect they had always shown before one misunderstanding had rewritten my story. In that quiet moment, I realized that the greatest victory had never been proving I was financially secure. It was reclaiming my own voice before anyone else decided to speak for it again. The weeks after our family meeting felt remarkably different. No dramatic promises were made that afternoon, and no one expected years of misunderstanding to disappear overnight. Instead, change arrived quietly, one thoughtful conversation at a time. Rebecca called a few days later and asked whether she could stop by for coffee. When she arrived, she carried a homemade apple pie and an expression I had not seen before. It was not confidence or certainty. It was humility. She sat across from me at the kitchen table for a long moment before speaking. "I have spent the last few days thinking about every conversation I repeated without ever checking whether it was true," she admitted. "I cannot change what people already heard, but I can make sure they hear the truth from me now." I believed her because her words were no longer trying to explain herself. They were taking responsibility. Over the next several weeks, I quietly noticed small changes. Friends from church smiled at me without the worried expressions that had become so familiar. Mrs. Reynolds laughed when she visited for tea and confessed she had been relieved to learn that my financial future was exactly as secure as it had always been. Rebecca had personally spoken with several relatives and close family friends, explaining that she had misunderstood how the education fund worked and that she should never have spoken about my finances as though they were facts. She did not erase every rumor overnight, but she did something much more important. She stopped allowing assumptions to grow in silence. Michael began calling me every Sunday evening again, not to ask whether I needed help managing my life, but simply to ask how my week had been. We talked about gardening, football, recipes, and the ordinary things families sometimes forget to enjoy when they become too busy trying to solve problems that do not exist. Ethan visited whenever he came home from college. One Saturday afternoon, we sat together on my back porch while autumn slowly gave way to winter. He handed me his midterm grades with the same excitement he had once shown me elementary school report cards. I smiled proudly before reminding him that the greatest way he could thank his grandfather was never through perfect grades, but by becoming a kind and honest man. He nodded thoughtfully and promised he would never forget the lesson our family had learned together. As winter passed and spring returned, I found myself standing once again beneath the maple trees Thomas had planted decades earlier. Their branches were filled with fresh green leaves, just as they had been every year of our marriage. I realized that those trees had quietly witnessed every chapter of our family's story, from birthday parties and graduation celebrations to misunderstandings and healing. They reminded me that strong roots do not prevent storms from coming. They simply help families survive them. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest gift Thomas and I ever left our grandson was never the education fund itself. Money can open the door to opportunity, but character determines what someone does after walking through it. I also learned something about myself. Remaining silent to protect someone's feelings is not always the same as protecting the relationship. Sometimes love requires speaking gently before assumptions become accepted as truth. Every evening, I still place Thomas's old leather folder back inside the drawer of the oak desk where he kept it for so many years. The documents inside have not changed, but I no longer think of them as financial records. I think of them as reminders that a lifetime of careful planning, quiet generosity, and honest conversations will always outlast the rumors that once tried to define them. And each time I close that drawer, I smile, knowing that the most valuable inheritance our family now carries forward is not measured in dollars, but in the wisdom to listen before speaking and to seek the truth before believing a story about someone we love. Thank you for listening and for being part of our community. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories.